Warhammer 40k, a brief introduction. So Warhammer is a war game that's pretty much a strategy game that you play on an actual board, physically, you know. It's not Monopoly, that's just like a spin-off thing that's been made. The miniatures, which are what we call the small figurines, they're very expensive and you assemble them on your own. Collecting them might even be a bit of a hobby besides just playing the game. It's actually pretty common to just collect a bunch of them. There are three main settings. It's fantasy / Age of Sigmar. The thing is that basically it's one setting that was then replaced by another, but figurines still exist for the first one. And there's 40k. 40k is the one we're going to be focusing on. It's basically like fantasy, except set in the far future and having some thematic differences. It is grimdark, that meaning grim and dark. In other words, very kind of everything is shit, so to speak. And very heavily so, over the top, some might say. And there is an expansive set of lore, as this setting has been around for quite a few decades at this point. Now, the setting of 40k, it's set in the Milky Way. The Earth exists there, even though it has a different name and usually goes by Terra, you know, like many fancies. It's set in the far future, or rather that's the intent. However, sorcery exists, hell exists, a bunch of other magic stuff exists. So think of it more like a sci-fi, or more like a fantasy in space type thing, kind of like Star Wars. There are a bunch of factions and sub-factions that I'm going to go through, and they are very much a divisive topic when talking about Warhammer. Now, very important to the fundamentals of this game is that there is such a thing as the warp. The warp is known by many names, but pretty much most people just call it the warp. It is basically hell in this world. It's where magic comes from, and it's also what allows for warp travel, which is pretty much, imagine the warp as a separate dimension. When you enter that dimension through whatever means, you can then travel inside of the warp and then come out the other end in a different part of your own galaxy. So that allows for kind of like teleportation. This is where demons live, it's where gods live, shit like that. Chaos is very prominent in the warp. It is basically a force of corruption. It's what demons are made of. They live off of, well, kind of like emotion / belief. It's not exactly clear 100%. It's a general force, however, there are four primary gods, that being, going from the left to the right, Tzeentch, Nurgle, Khorne, and Slaanesh. That being the god of change, the god of death / decay, the god of blood and war, and the god of sexy times and emotion, pretty much. Now, the Imperium of Man. This is the main faction, so to speak, of the setting. It is made up of 1,000,000 worlds across the galaxy, by far the most dominant faction. It is the human faction, meaning that all other humans pretty much that you see are going to be part of the Imperium of Man. It is a totalitarian and fanatical empire. It is pretty much kind of like a theocracy mixed with communism, mixed with fascism. It's pretty much got a bunch of elements from different things. It has stagnating tech, that being that pretty much all the tech inside of the 40k universe controlled by the Imperium of Man, they are made up of blueprints which are slowly disappearing or being corrupted or whatever. That meaning that they almost never make new technology but only ever use the old one. Okay? Reason behind that is something I'll get to later. Most people in the 40k universe live on hive worlds, that being pretty much worlds that are just mega cities. One example of a small hive world would be the thing you see in front of you. And if you look at like the bottom left, you'll see that even this is pretty goddamn massive. You can have hive worlds the size of a continent, or like rather when the hive city is the size of a continent. And when you have a bunch of those next to each other, that's a hive world. They'll have the emperor, of course. An Imperium has to have an emperor, and both the architecture and language and culture, all that, it's called High Gothic. Don't think too much about it. Yeah, that's just a funny little meme I found. Now, other than humans, you have Xenos. That's a general term for all non-human life forms. There are primarily the fantasy derivatives, that being the Eldar, elves, orcs, and chaos. That's with an asterisk because they're also kind of sci-fi. And then you have the originals for the 40k setting that don't exist in fantasy. That being the Tyranids, Tau, and Necrons. Necrons is with an asterisk because it has an equivalence, but not exactly the same, in the Tomb Kings. You have some sanctioned Xenos in the world, but for the most part, the Imperium of Man just kills everyone they come across. Eldar, space elves. They're a dying race for some reason. They created Slaanesh, that being the chaos god of emotion. Basically, they had a big orgy and that created Slaanesh. So it's the newest of the chaos gods. You have Craftworld Eldar, Drukhari, and Exodites. Craft worlds live on craft worlds, that being big ships with lots of houses and shit on it. Drukhari are dark elves. They live in a special region, pretty much hidden away from the rest of the galaxy. And Exodites are what you would basically call cavemen elves. Yeah. Orks, they are orcs just with weird spelling. They are made up of a sort of fusion between being biological and being fungi. For the most part, they're just fungi. Most people would just call it that, but the wiki says it's a combination. That being, in other words, they are mushrooms. So if you kill a bunch of orcs, then they will just have spores, basically small seeds that will spread and create more of them. Okay, so it's a bit weird. They're basically one big mushroom cluster. They call each other the boys a lot of the time. Basically, they have a funny way of saying it. They have funny talk. They're pretty much football hooligans, British football hooligans. They're the most numerous species that we know of. There's one more later that might be more numerous. And they have a thing called the power of belief. If enough of them think that something is true, then it will be. You know, if you shout BANG! At a little goblin, it's probably gonna just fucking die of a heart attack. But it's gonna think it's been shot. Maybe it's even gonna get a bullet wound from thinking it's been shot. This is why they're able to have spaceships, despite the fact that they would obviously never make anything that's actually airtight. Another thing, they love war. They're not very intelligent, but they do like having a good time. A lot of people say they are basically the most fun-loving faction there is, which is true. Tyranids, these are a hive mind of aliens. They're kind of bug-like. Everything they are is biological, so even if they fire a gun, that is somehow biological. Not going to explain it. There's more of them arriving constantly. They're eating worlds. And they basically have a sub-faction within them called Gene Stealers, which are pretty much infiltrators that come to a, for example, human world. They infect people with their DNA and create cults and revolutions that basically make it easier for the actual main Tyranid fleets to come and eat it up. And yeah, by the way, when I say everything is biological, that includes the ships. There are supposedly, again, more arriving. Pretty much the Milky Way is just like being explored by the Tyranids. Necrons. They are pretty much dead Egyptian Terminators. Again, they're the equivalent to the Tomb Kings in fantasy, and that pretty much means that they are kind of like if you killed a pharaoh, then reanimated him into from being a skeleton, and then he was also electronic without a soul. These guys pretty much, yeah, I'll just do it by the points. Tomb Worlds Awakening, that means that pretty much they used to be a big dominant species across the galaxy, but as it stands now, they have been dormant for a long time, but are just waking up. They have very advanced tech, but don't usually use it. They created their own gods, which then ate their bodies and soul, making them into the machines you see today. Not going to dwell too much on them, but they're a very cool faction with a cool aesthetic, so I love them. Tau. These are the newest guys in 40k, so it's a pretty small faction, but got a lot of fans, you know. They follow something called the Greater Good, which is basically an ideology/religious system that believes that they will unify the galaxy and bring about peace. That is the greater good. They are a confederation, meaning that they have several alien species within them. They're not just one species. In fact, they have different castes, kind of like in Hindu culture, where you have different specializations within castes, and some being worth more than others. They are small but expanding, and recently discovered. That means basically Games Workshop recently made them. Alright, the Emperor of Man. Very cool guy, very based and all that. He's basically, I don't know if I can say this, Space Hitler. He is a genocidal maniac in some ways, but at the same time, he has incredible magic powers and unified the galaxy. So it's kind of like, I guess, Hitler in his own fantasies. This guy unified Terra, and that being Earth, and then launched a great crusade in which he conquered just about all of the galaxy. He has a bunch of sons that are called Primarchs. They're pretty much demigods. He is pretty much a god himself. That's why a lot of people today call him the God Emperor of Mankind, even though he himself was an atheist, which is pretty funny. There was an event known as the Horus Heresy, where a bunch of his sons, half of them, decided to rebel. There was a bloody civil war, and at the end of it, the Emperor of Man was wounded and put in a life support chair called the Golden Throne. He is still technically alive, but many call him the Corpse Emperor because he cannot move and do shit. He is still able to affect the world. So sometimes if some bullshit happens, they just say that, oh yeah, the God Emperor of Mankind did it. Because as it stands, he is pretty much more God than man at this point. Space Marines. These guys are basically the elite troops of the Imperium of Man. There are 1,000 chapters of 1,000 men, meaning 1,000,000 in total, approximately. They are genetically modified child soldiers, pretty much. Some of them are children, others are hundreds of years old. Pretty much, they're taken in at a young age and then trained. They use bolters for the most part, which are these big guns you can see here, them wielding, look kind of funny. The bolters fire basically small missiles that are shot, so it's not really a gun, it's technically a missile launcher, but it functions like a gun. Look pretty funny. There was recently an upgrade to Primaris Space Marines, which basically are bigger and smarter versions of them. And there also exists Chaos Marines, which are chaos. They're Chaos Space Marines, right? They're the Marines during the Horus Heresy that turned to the Chaos Gods. So there's lots of variations. Sisters of Battle. They are a part of the Ecclesiarchy, basically one of the factions within the Imperium of Man. They kill heretics for the most part, and also Xenos. And they are one organization. They're basically space nuns that are very strong and cool. Mechanicus. They are tech priests, basically. They worship machines and store knowledge. There is such a thing in the 40k universe as machine spirit, which are basically that every single machine has a small spirit. The bigger the machine, the bigger the spirit. That means that if you worship your gun, it's probably going to jam less frequently. It might also just be that worshipping the gun is the process of oiling it. So, take from that what you will. But the bigger the machine, the bigger of a soul it has, meaning the bigger of a personality. So these guys are basically the ones most focused on that. They have their own tiny religion. And they mainly manufacture the equipment that the Imperium of Man uses. They guard blueprints, meaning that all the blueprints the Imperium of Man has, pretty much all of them are stored on Mars with the Mechanicus. They're technically not part of the Imperium of Man, but a separate entity, even though they recently mostly integrated. It's some complicated stuff. That's what the Treaty of Mars is. So they're allowed to be pretty much mostly independent, but still integrated. They are in charge of creating and maintaining servitors, which are basically humans that have been lobotomized and turned into cyborgs. Tech priests themselves are mostly cybernetic. Imperial Guard. So these guys are the primary type of soldier within the Imperium of Man, other than PDF, that being Planetary Defense Forces. The Imperial Guard are pretty much, they fill every single part of the Imperium's military that the Navy and the Marines and such can't cover. They mainly use las guns. It's a cheap but still pretty strong weapon that's reliable and works. They are incredibly diverse, meaning that there's lots of different variations within the Imperial Guard. You can basically take any historical thing, like any group of people, like say, oh, I want Space Knights. Now you can have Space Knights. There's an Imperial Guard regiment for that. Or you want Soviet soldiers. There's a Guard regiment for that. Or maybe you want fucking Napoleonic guys, a Guard regiment. There's a shit ton of variation within them. So because they don't have superpowers of any kind, unlike most of the people in the different factions, they make heavy use of artillery and tanks, basically making up for in tech what they lack in muscle. They are cannon fodder, meaning that there are a shit ton of them, probably billions, if not even hundreds of billions, probably. There's loads of different ways that they're run. But almost all Imperial Guard regiments have a commissar, which is basically kind of like in Soviet times, there used to be commissars that were military leaders that mainly enforced politics within the army. And but here, they're mainly the people who shoot you when you don't immediately charge at the enemy following orders, you know. And when it comes to the diversity, just here are a couple examples of how varied the Guard can be. I could name all of these, but not too important. I love them. Most people like them. Cadian soldiers are the most common ones. They come from a planet called Cadia. The planet is situated right next to the Eye of Terror, which is basically a big place where loads of demons and shit come out of. So it's a dangerous place, therefore it's a fortress planet, meaning that everyone there needs to serve the military. That's why it says every child a white shield. Basically a paramilitary organization. There's a shit ton of them, so they are exported to different parts of the galaxy along with defending their home, at least until recently. Pretty much all the miniatures you have of the Imperial Guard are going to be Cadians. Sadly, during the 13th Black Crusade, Cadia was destroyed. It's very common to hear people say either Cadia stands or something that's kind of emotional, which is Cadia broke before the Guard did. Because apparently the Guard was still fighting while oxygen was leaving them, while the planet under them was crumbling. It's destroyed, but there still exists regiments, both in their honor and in more like the people who weren't there. Krieg. It was a planet and now guard regiments, or a bunch of guard regiments that used to be very prosperous. They ended up rebelling against the Imperium of Man, and as the Imperium weren't able to send reinforcements to crush the rebels, the commander of the loyalist forces on the planet were given nuclear launch codes which wiped the surface of the planet. They kept fighting for 500 years, basically creating perfect soldiers. Not perfect in the sense of being perfect at fighting, but being perfect at being soldiers. That means dying. They have a technology known as Vitae Womb, which is not specified exactly how it works, but pretty much it can create a bunch of soldiers pretty quickly. And very high amounts of them too. When they made contact with the Imperium of Man again, after having defeated the rebellion, again after 500 years, they simply sent the message of, we've won, pretty much. The Imperium of Man responded with, send us men. And then they, instead of sending one regiment, they sent 20. And the Imperium since has been like, these people are weird, but they fight. They also have cavalry, which is fucking awesome. Now, what even is Warhammer 40k? It is a bunch of different things. It's more like philosophical almost, but like it can be basically a setting of extreme faith, extreme strength, extremities of, or not extremities, but extremes of all kinds, you know, extremities too if you're into that. It can be pretty much just a incredibly fun journey watching stupid shit happen where stuff is just overpowered. You know, you're basically living real life history through the events of 40k, except with a fantastical spin. You know, it can be, if you take it seriously, which there are certainly stories within the universe which are there to be taken seriously, it can be tragic, it can be inspiring, you know, it can be a whole load of different things. It's basically whatever you make it. I, for one, like to make it a setting whenever playing Arma 3. And yeah, it's pretty much up to you what you want to make of it. I have like one miniature I've painted myself, so I'm not the greatest when it comes to explaining the game, but I do love the setting. So yeah, hope you enjoyed watching this. Probably learned something. Sorry about the rambling. Basically just wanted to make this video because I made this presentation a while ago. I presented it first to one girl and then I presented it to a bunch of my friends recently, and I was just like, hey, maybe I'll make a video. And yeah, I guess that's kind of it. Have a good one.